Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to this very important webinar that looks at the connections between the current ongoing pandemic and climate change. This is part of the series of webinars under the overall rubric of Nature Matters that WWF India is organizing as part of its 50th anniversary celebrations. So it is a time when all of us are perforce perhaps, and some of us, because we would anyway do so, are looking at the environment, are looking at air pollution issues, and especially looking at health issues given the state of the pandemic. And I think we have an excellent panel today to tell us exactly what is the connection between the two. Before we start with the panel, just two small housekeeping announcements. One is, I hope you know, we are recording this, and since we are recording this, the recording shall be available later. The organizers will tell us exactly where the recording will be available. And the second point that housekeeping point is that this webinar is also available on Facebook Live. We already have an audience joining us from Facebook Live. And those of you who are joining on Facebook Live are just as welcome to ask questions through the question and answer chat box or any other field that you can use on Facebook. And the organizers will collate all the questions. As I said, we have a very distinguished panel, and I definitely don't want to stand between you and the panelists. I'm going to start by, well, I will not even try to introduce him because most of you know him, I'm sure. But for a few who may not, Dr. Ajay Mathur is the Director General of TERI. He has been the Director General of the Bureau of Energy Efficiency in the Government of India. He has headed the climate change team of World Bank. He has been the President of Suzlon Energy. He has headed the interim secretariat of the Green Climate Fund. And for years, I've also seen him as a key Indian climate change negotiator as part of the Indian government delegation at the UNFCCC negotiations. There is nobody better, I'm sure, to look at this junction between air pollution, health, and COVID-19. That is why we are very glad that Dr. Mathur has agreed to give us the keynote presentation today. Ajay, over to you.
Thank you very much, Joydeep, and thank you for the very kind words. I think we have all been in the trenches together, you and I and many others who are here, and I think we have all learned from it. Nowhere have we learned more than in the interrelationship between climate and air pollution. If you give me a moment, I will share a presentation with you on the screen. I think that may have done it, right? I'm trying to see if I can make it full page. Yes.
Yes, now it is.
All of us fully understand that a very large number of cities in India do not meet our own air quality standards. And I emphasize our own because our own air quality threshold is actually higher than the global threshold, the WHO threshold. This is a matter of concern for each one of us. It is a matter, obviously, of our own healths, but it is also a matter of the livability of cities, of their ability to grow and become larger engines of economic growth. and therefore have become inhibitors to growth rather than becoming accelerators of growth. Consequently, we have looked into what are the issues behind this high growth in emissions. Because when we looked at the emissions from cities alone, these numbers did not make sense. They were too high. So where is this coming from? And the next slide talks about the kinds of pictures that you see. I would like you to note, first of all, that there is a difference between summer and winter. Winters are far worse than summers are. But the second thing that I'd like to note is you see the large areas of the country which have got poor air quality. It's not just the cities alone, but large regional tracts which have poor air quality. This is something that I'd like you to, this is the first point that I'd like to leave with you. Why does this happen? This happens primarily because of the biomass that is burnt in homes. This is not the biomass burning that occurs in the end of October when the paddy straw is burnt. No, this is not that. This is the biomass that is burnt in homes for cooking across households in the country, particularly in rural areas, because the penetration of LPG even now is relatively poor in rural areas. This is very important because it highlights that pollution in India is not a purely urban issue, and it also highlights the importance of cooking in households, particularly in rural households, as a source of air pollution. Now, having said that, I also want to make the case that much of this biomass pollution, the results of burning biomass in inefficient stoves in households across the country, but particularly in rural households, leads to a lot of black carbon being produced. This black carbon leads, amongst other things, obviously it leads to domestic air pollution, but it also leads to climate impacts. And reduction in this black carbon can be one of the prime reasons, the prime movers of both reducing the air pollution in the air in urban and regional areas, but also in accelerating the move towards a lower climate emissions future. I think this is a connection that we should not forget. The next point that I'd like to highlight is, where does this pollution come from? And for the purposes of comparison, we have created two pie charts. One on the left focusing on where the CO2 emissions come from, and the one on the right focusing on where the air quality, particularly the particulate pollution, comes from. You will note that industrial and power sector together account for 47 plus 3, 50% of the pollution as far as particulate pollutions are concerned. And the reduction of the power sector to 3% is primarily because of the air pollution control devices that have been required now for many, many years. It's starting with ESPs and now ending most recently with emission controls, which have not yet been fully put into place, but would look at much more stringent air control, would look at sulfur dioxide control, would look at NOx control, would look at mercury control. However, what it has meant is pollution from power stations is much more controlled than pollution from industries. On the other hand, if you look at CO2 emissions, we see the power sector as being the largest contributor of CO2 emissions, largely because of the coal that still forms the vast bulk of fuel that is used for power generation. I would also like you to focus on the residential sector. The residential sector, when you look at CO2 emissions, is just 4%. when you look at particulate emissions, it's 29%. And that 29%, as those previous pictures showed, result in the regional swaths of air pollution, the regional broad air pollution that occurs across the country. Why is it so low in as far as CO2 emissions are concerned? Because on the net, India is a country where deforestation is largely controlled. The Forest Survey of India reports tell us that, on the margin, we are actually a net afforester. We are a country where there is net afforestation and not a net deforestation. There is yet around, particularly for some areas, a net deforestation that occurs, and that is the CO2 emissions that you see here. This also presents a challenge, because as we move to the future and move towards LPG as a cooking fuel, it would lead to an increase in emissions. LPG, after all, when it burns, produces CO2. And that CO2 is not, it is additional to that which is fixed by trees. So there will be, as we move towards LPG use, there will be an increase in the carbon dioxide emissions, though there will be a decrease in the air quality emissions. So that is a trade-off, which I thought I should mention, because as we come to this later, we will look at the kinds of strategies where the two can come together. Now, can we integrate the two? So we looked at what happens if the nationally determined contributions are fully met in 2030, and we continue on the same path as we move towards 2050. Note that the red areas largely disappear, or they become much less. In the BAU, they are still there, and you see the reduction that occurs when the NDCs are fully implemented. This alone tells us that with particularly the industrial sector moving towards greater carbon intensity, the NDC, which says that the carbon intensity of the Indian economy would decline by 33 to 35% in 2030 compared to 2005. And the second NDC, which looks at least 40% of our electricity generating capacity being non-fossil fuel in 2030. This is good. You will wonder about the red part on the western side of India. That's largely the dust that comes in from the deserts of West Asia, and is a natural phenomenon which is not so much controlled by man-made either interventions, or is not even occurring because of man-made reasons. So there is a limit to how much we can do to control it. But I would like to leave you with the fact that moving successfully on the nationally determined contributions also helps in reducing the air quality emissions. So this is a slide on which I'd like to spend some time. This looks at the specific areas where interventions would help both climate emissions as well as air quality emissions. Clearly, as the last slide showed, when we implement the nationally determined contributions, and particularly power generation moving more and more and more to renewables, we see the benefits both on the carbon dioxide side as well as on the air quality side. So the energy transition to renewables is the main pillar on which future air quality depends in the future. The second is industry. And very clearly, reducing the carbon intensity of India, which is typically the carbon intensity in industry, not fully, but largely, is the second part. And here again, these are also large contributors, as you saw, to air quality, to air pollution, to particulates in air pollution, and to the air quality. Again, this is a part which is being addressed both by the local emission controls on air pollution, but are also being led by the larger economic shifts which have made renewable electricity today the cheapest form of electricity in India when the sun is shining. Obviously, when the sun is not shining at night, coal electricity continues to be the cheapest electricity. And therefore, we are in this strange time, in strange window, where we see a simultaneous growth of both coal-based generation and renewable-based generation, because in different times of the day, they each become the cheapest form of electricity. However, and this is an aside, recent tenders by the Solar Energy Corporation of India have come up with prices for, to be delivered 2 years from now, for round-the-clock renewable electricity, which means solar plus storage, batteries, which will be price competitive with coal electricity. Now, this is a huge thing, because what this means is that in the future, there would be no more coal-based generation. It would be instead, there would be no more addition to coal-based generation. I want to emphasize its addition, but that addition would be solar plus a storage. The second area that I would like to cover is cooking. Now, we discussed that briefly earlier. This is important because this leads not only to the air pollution that we saw, it also leads to the health, particularly of the women who are doing the cooking, being extremely poor because of the high level of pollutants in kitchens. I remember the late Kirk Smith, who I deeply miss, once said that a woman cooking inside a hut in India inhales as much polyaromatic hydrocarbons, PAH, a carcinogenic compound, as much PAH as equivalent to 20 packs of cigarettes a day. And this, to a very large extent, explains the poor quality of health in rural areas, particularly of women. It also highlights the rationale behind the large distribution of LPG now under the Ujjwala scheme across the country and especially in rural areas. However, what we have seen is that while connections have been given, it does not mean that though the cylinders are refilled on a regular basis. This is because of incomes. People are often not able to afford the refilling of the LPG cylinder. And my colleagues who carry out these activities on the ground tell me that in any part of the country, there are at least 10% of the rural population which is living at incomes which are less than what it takes to buy a LPG cylinder. And I think this is something that we need to address as we go ahead. But the second issue also is that the supply of LPG cylinders in rural areas is relatively poor. And consequently, even if I have a cylinder, even if I have the economic wherewithal to refill it, when it is empty, it is several days before I get another cylinder. Now, I remember that as a child, this was exactly the problem in our household. We moved to LPG in around 1967. But till about 1972 or 1973, after the India-Pakistan war, we got the second cylinder. And in these 5 years or 6 years, every time the LPG cylinder finished, we moved back to kerosene stove or a cook stove which was based on coke. But once the second cylinder was available, that made life much easier, because you could now wait for 6 or 7 days to get another cylinder, and meanwhile connect the second cylinder that you have to the cook stove. So you had reliable supply of LPG. And this again argues for the importance of the reliable supply of the clean fuel. As I said earlier, there is this trade-off between the LPG producing CO2 and the wooden cook stoves producing much less CO2. That is true. But because the cook stoves are inefficient, there's a lot of black carbon produced. So if you compute the black carbon advantages and the disadvantages because of moving to LPG, the two are about the same. So till there is a very, very large usage of LPG, there's 100% penetration of LPGs, we will not see the share of LPG in carbon dioxide emissions increase. So I think in the short term, it makes great sense for the reasons of the health of domestic people, for the health of the women who cook on biomass, to move towards LPG cylinders. This would greatly improve air quality. It would also, in the medium term, ensure that climate emissions are, if they don't increase, they will, if they don't decrease, they will at least not increase. But in the longer term, I think we need to move towards something else, such as electric induction cookers, where the electricity is coming from renewable energy. However, I sometimes ask myself, I live in Delhi, where there's very reliable supply of electricity, and I have not moved to an electric induction cooker. And I wonder why I haven't done it. And consequently, what are the kinds of social challenges in moving from LPG cylinders or piped natural gas towards electric induction cookers. But that, I think, is an issue that we need to address as we move ahead, because that would imply that we would have zero CO2 emissions and zero air pollution. I also think we need to look at transport. Together with industry and power, we saw transport as the major source of air pollution. I think moving towards electric mobility would help. More than anything else, it would help particularly in the two-wheeler sector. Two-wheelers and three-wheelers together, and buses and trucks in urban areas account, the transport sector accounts for about 20 to 25% of the emissions. And all of these others, two-wheelers, three-wheelers, buses, trucks, account for something like 16, 17% of those 25% emissions. In other words, four-wheelers are about 8%. If we can move those 16 or 17%, the two-wheelers, the three-wheelers, the buses, if we can move them to electric transport, I think we would have much cleaner cities. Again, as far as two-wheelers are concerned, this is an area in which there is even cost effectiveness. But the issue of charging is something that stymies movement on this. In a survey that we had carried out, it turned out that, very interestingly, people who were potential buyers of two-wheelers said that they were not investing in two-wheelers because they didn't see enough charging stations. On the other hand, people who had electric two-wheelers said that they charged their batteries at home. So we are stuck in this strange situation where we may need to develop charging stations. They wouldn't be used, but they would be necessary for the growth of electric vehicle ownership. So in public transportation and in two-wheelers, I think we need to push hard. And again, if the electricity is coming from renewables, as more and more is, then we will see a simultaneous move towards both air quality improvement and lowering of CO2 emissions. Organic farming is also important. I don't want to spend very much time on it, but it is something which is my personal bugbear. A very large part of the air pollution in cities comes from what is known as secondary pollutants. Secondary air particles are those which are put up when things like ammonia from the fertilizer rise in the air, and they combine with sulfates or nitrates from, say, drains, and so on, and combine and make ammonium nitrate, which then falls as a particle. So it goes up as a gas and falls as a particle. The largest source of the it will not happen if you didn't have too much ammonia coming out. So this is important. And if we can therefore move towards more organic fertilizers, towards fertilizers that are spiked with mycorrhiza kinds of organisms, then we would need less of the ammonia-based fertilizer. I will also mention wastes and deforestation. We have seen the advantages of afforestation in looking in stopping the dust that was coming from Western India. It is a good measure. If you look in the western part of Delhi, there's far less dust than there was 20 years ago. It's not a foolproof thing, but it helps. So I think these are the kinds of interventions which can help reduce both air pollution as well as climate emissions. Is all that I said true? If we look at the lockdown, what the lockdown did was essentially transportation and industry went to zero. The numbers that we saw was that last year, at the same time, the emissions, the pollution levels in Delhi were about 72, 73 micrograms per cubic meter. This year, they were in the 50 micrograms per cubic meter range. This is completely consistent with a zeroing of emissions from the industry and the transport sector. And consequently, when we looked at the kinds of interventions in the industry and the transport sector, I think those are those which can lead to very quick reductions, both in climate emissions and the improvements in air quality. I'm not going to spend much time on this. We believe that there's a set of actions that is absolutely important to enhance air quality, and clearly integrating the policies for the control of air quality and climate together, and complement, and the importance given to short-lived climate pollutants, particularly black carbon, which is coming from the inefficient combustion of biomass in cook stoves, particularly cook stoves, particularly in rural areas, is something that can help us in addressing both these things together. I know that I've taken a lot of time, Joydeep, but I want to thank WWF. I want to thank you for the opportunity to share our thoughts with all of you. I remain ready to answer any questions that you may have either now or later. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Ajay. This was, I think, an excellent overview of the exact situation, and allows me to segue directly into our next panelist, who is Dr. Joshi. Dr. Tushar Joshi is a board member of the Central Pollution Control Board. He is the former director of the Center for Occupational Health in Maulana Azad Medical College in New Delhi. He's been a lead expert on occupational health for the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, FSSI. He teaches occupational health all over the world. And who better than to talk to us about the health impacts and the health connections, both negative and positive, between air pollution and health, especially in this day and age of a pandemic, when we are in the middle of a pandemic that is largely airborne, and that is how the virus is being transmitted. Dr. Joshi, I will be very happy. I will all be very happy to hear from you. May I get your permission to start by asking you a question, a specific question that leads from Ajay's presentation, as to you saw the situation between summer and winter. Winter is coming. We expect maybe the air pollution will go up in this winter. Will that lead to more transmission of the coronavirus CoV-2?
Well, so far as we have information, first of all, thank you very much for having me on this panel and introducing me. Actually, my more concern is always about health. I have been fortunate to complete an online course on COVID management from the University of Berkeley, and that has given me a lot of information. So far as we know, I mean, there was some initial thoughts that probably COVID conditions should get better with the rising temperature. That hasn't happened actually. In fact, if you see, we have every day more number of cases even with the rising temperature. But certainly, I remember when I was in the, I was asked by the health ministry, I mean, the prime minister asked all the ministries to frame a climate action plan, and the health ministry framed its own. So I was surprised that when I was asked by the Ministry of Health, the impact of the climate change and the global warming was not factoring into the workers' exposure. I mean, mostly our steel plants, our power plants, they are all located down south and in the west, where the normal temperatures in the summer months can reach up to 50 degrees Celsius. And so the impact of the climate change and global temperatures, rising global temperature would be far more worse in India on the outdoor workers in the steel plant, power plants, all the industry where normally the temperature are very high. With the COVID situation, as far as we have been monitoring, because I'm now with the health minister associated with the COVID management, we have not found any evidence of COVID, I mean, related to the temperature. Of course, yes, it does get killed when you apply heat to the virus. But so far, I think that we have not been able to establish a connection between. But certainly, what is happening and what our worst fears are that as the winters arrive and we have rising air pollution, which has a direct bearing on the respiratory health, and the lungs are the principal organ of entry and the main target organ for this virus also. So we are fearing that this could compound the COVID situation more, and we already our health infrastructure is under tremendous stress. So that's what I would say, that we are keeping our fingers crossed, and we hope that this time with the government intervention, the NCAP and all other government plans, we shouldn't have that much parali burning, and we shouldn't have that worse climate, I mean, effect. So let's hope that things will not be as bad as they used to be every year.
Thank you, Dr. Joshi. That's important. It's important to live in hope, but I suppose we need to do something to make sure that that hope becomes reality. Yes, agricultural residue burning does add to a temporary spike for maybe anything between a fortnight. Sometimes it has even gone up to a month. But for a longer period, I think a lot more needs to be done in other areas such as industry and transport, or even regular household use. Although, as Ajay just showed, household use is not that big an issue. It's mostly, we are talking here, power plants, industry, transport.
If you permit me, I'll make a small comment also.
Yes,
you know,
please.
I just an hour before we completed another meeting of the Ministry of Environment and Forest, because we have we have to clear projects. And today we had a petroleum sector presenting its proposals. And one of the proposals that came up and which was really raising our concern about the climate was the shale gas extraction. And that probably we were very concerned that it will liberate a lot of methane. And I think that the government of India right now is considering giving more licenses for fracking and the hydraulic fracturing and for the shale gas. Probably that is a situation which can further aggravate the carbon footprints, and the global warming may get worse. And in our industry committee, we have made it a mandatory condition that we ask every proponent that what contribution they are going to make towards reducing their carbon footprints. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that is a very important point that you have raised, and I'm really thank you to bring this to the attention of everybody. fracking, as we know, has been a highly debated issue in North America, in parts of Europe.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. So, in fact, this is something that probably needs to be discussed in more detail than merely within the ministry. Probably needs to be discussed in Parliament, in the public, in media, and elsewhere. Dr. Joshi, my next question to you is that you are you are definitely a part of the decision making group now on COVID management,
Right.
and you are looking at it on how to reduce the transmission. How can how can cleaner air help you in managing COVID?
Well, you see, certainly the quality of air, air quality has a bearing on the person's immunity. And one of the lessons that we have learned, the people who are immune compromised for any reason, maybe due to some comorbid condition or because of climate condition or because of the air pollution, is definitely going to make the situation worse because that has a direct bearing on their immunity. So I think that air pollution and the heat, we can't have a climate acclimatization to heat. Heat is a toxin. So people don't appreciate it that at 45 degrees, the proteins become denatured. So I think as of now, we have this concern that air pollution, if it rises, it may again complicate the COVID situation because we can't quantify, but it certainly have a negative impact on the immunity of the people.
Right. Thank you, sir. That is a very telling phrase. Heat is a toxin. I'm sure many people are going to quote you on this. I think that particular phrase has not been used to the best of my knowledge, but it probably should be used by people who are looking at climate change. So, with your permission, can I move to the other panelists and come back to you with questions?
Good.
Unless there is some more, any other intervention that you would like to make at this moment?
No, I mean I am a member of the task force that Supreme Court has directed CPCB, and our real concern begins from November, December, and January and February. We have sleepless nights. We meet at least 2-3 times a week, and I mean there are a lot of bombardment from people, there are a lot of queries, and so that really puts us in a great corner. And we hope that this year situation should be better because so far we don't have the parameters as bad as they used to be every year at this point of time.
I'm glad to hear that. Yes, I also personally think that the fact that people in this country, especially people who live in cities, actually saw blue skies after a very long time during the lockdown may have led to some, at least, change of mindset.
Sure, sure.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. I think there are questions coming up for you. Please. So I'll be very grateful if you stay with us. And
I'm there.
Very good. Thank you. Our next panelist is Shloka Nath. Shloka is currently the head of sustainability and special projects at the Tata Trusts. She leads the organization's climate, energy, and environment work. She implements and funds sustainable and scalable solutions. And most famously at the moment, I suppose, she is the executive director of India Climate Collaborative, which is making waves in the climate change space in India as the new organization to go to if you want to actually work to combat climate change in this country. She is still on the board of the Bombay Natural History Society, an organization that all of us have admired for over a century, and it's been there. She has worked in specifically women's impact funds in the past. So again, with Shloka, what I'm going to do is to ask you, Shloka, if you want to make any introductory remark, or can I ask you a question straight away?
Please go right ahead, Reddy.
Okay, thanks. See, after what Ajay said, after what Dr. Joshi said, how can clean energy transition be accelerated to meet the clean air goals, the climate goals, and the health goals, which now have to be seen together, not as silos? Give us an overview, an idea of how to accelerate, move towards clean energy faster.
Thanks, Joydeep, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. I also want to thank you for your background, both yours and Dan's. I feel like we're setting the stage here for the aspiration towards clean air. It's definitely making me feel good just seeing that in the background there. I think you said it rightly, Dr. Mathur. He's someone I greatly admire, and he's done an incredible amount of work in this space. He put it right in terms of just defining how crucial the clean energy transition is going to be towards achieving clean air for all of us. I think there are sort of two specific points that I would focus on. He's already brought up the issue of sort of power plants and thermal power plants, to be specific. I think there's a real need to point the government towards delays in compliance with thermal power plant emission norms, which were issued back in 2015, and to demand urgent and strong enforcement actions. I think we also have to talk very seriously now about, retiring the older, more polluting, expensive power plants. As we know, they are major polluters. They do contribute almost 60% of particulate matter pollution of all industries. In addition to a whole host of other toxic emissions, linked to respiratory as well as other illnesses. It's a really concerning issue. I think this was CSE that estimated over 70% of the roughly 21 gigawatts of thermal power plants that are now 30 years old do not seem to be in the pipeline for retirement, and they will be unable to comply with the standards by 2022. And about 75% of these, that's 3/4 of them, are in critically polluted areas or in close proximity to dense populations. I'm sure this is something Dr. Joshi will also appreciate in terms of what those effects are on our health. So that's a really sort of important piece in moving forward on the clean energy transition. I think the other thing that I want to point out is that the current government ostensibly, does want to make sort of maximum coal available at the earliest. And so the plan for the sector, has really three main aspects in this regard, which is opening it up to the private sector. It's investing over 500 billion in infrastructure, as well as sort of incentivizing coal gasification. And while the COVID-19 crisis does require urgent action, and indeed India does have to rely on coal for the foreseeable future, the government's pragmatism of using the pandemic as an opportunity should extend to climate change and air pollution, which are arguably more threatening in the long run. I think that's a case that both Dr. Joshi and Dr. Mathur have made very eloquently just now. The only nod to renewable energy in the Atmanirbhar Bharat is a promise to incentivize solar, PV manufacturing and advanced battery storage, which are necessary in light of the disruption in the international supply chains. And they've been sort of bundled under this terminology of new champion sectors. So state authorities really do have to ensure strict enforcement of rules governing pollution. Our environment minister has, listed issues such as emission levels and waste management. These require quantum improvement. However, there is no mention of the center's role in attaining this benchmark beyond imparting advice on environmental awareness and the philosophy of living in harmony with nature. Finally, I think the last thing I just want to say on this is, many environmental economists have sort of come out with this. And they have said that the 500 billion rupees, which have been currently earmarked for the coal sector, would be better directed towards renewable energy. Because unlike coal, which has been experiencing a sustained decline in jobs due to mechanization, renewable energy does tend to be far more labor intensive, and it can create new jobs. So I think that really is the way to go forward, not just for sort of air pollution outcomes and goals, but also just in terms of how India needs to recover from this pandemic.
Thanks, Shloka. I have a follow-up question for you. Being both reporters, we are allowed, right? Right. As you point out, and I also felt so, that India's economic stimulus to come out of the COVID-induced economic problems, to me, did not have enough green elements.
Mm-hmm.
Given that, I know that you have been working for quite a few years in that interface between renewable energy, clean energy, environment, financial markets. So what can the investor community, what can the financial markets, what role can they play where they also make money and we can move towards a greener economy?
That's a great question. It's actually not sort of that hard in terms of reimagining the future, because I keep saying this, rather than focusing on the ease of doing business, we should really focus on the ease of doing climate. And there is a huge reframing that's involved in that, but it's a really important one. And I think it's one that, India, the time has come for India to sort of move forward on this. When it comes to the investor community, there's a whole host of areas where we could really move forward without having to necessarily sacrifice the goals of, return on investment, so to speak. Renewable energy, which Dr. Mathur mentioned, is a huge one. There's also the MSME sector. There's a tremendous need to kind of push them forward when it comes to the transition, again, towards clean energy. And that's a huge role for the investor community to play in ensuring that clean tech startups get their access to capital, to ensure that the MSME sector comes out of the pandemic, with as little sort of damage, long-term damage as possible. The third, I would say, is really when it comes to sort of working hand in hand with government to really push forward the necessary sort of policy reforms that do need to take place. That's another big area and scope for the investor community to play a real role in ensuring that the green recovery that we're all looking for is one that has less of a bumpy road than we would hope for.
Thank you, Shloka. Please don't go away. I can see in the Q&A there are questions for you. I just want to move to our next panelist now, and then we'll come back to you. Please stay on. Thanks. Our next panelist is Dr. Daniel Greenbaum. Dr. Greenbaum is the president of the Health Effects Institute. And what he does is to globally, he provides information, policy recommendations, and science about the health effects of air pollution. So he's right there in the center of what we are talking about. He's advising governments and international organizations all over the world on the health effects of air pollution and how to minimize air pollution and consequently minimize the health effects of air pollution. And he's very much updated. He's very updated on the situation in India because he's been part of a research team, which recently, many of us know this because of the organization's branch in India as the EU Chicago study on air pollution in India, where the very recent one, he was a part of that. Welcome, Dr. Greenbaum. My first question to you, sir, is now that we have a pandemic, now that we have a lot of economic stimulus packages from various countries of various degrees of green, of various shades of green, what are the lessons that India can learn from other countries?
Well, first of all, thank you, Jyoti, for the invitation. I'm very, very glad to be here. And congratulations to WWF-India for its 50th anniversary. That's a no small achievement. My background, which Shloka noticed, is in honor of WWF. It's actually, I wish I was where this picture is, which is in Tierra del Fuego at the very tip of South America, where tens of thousands of shorebirds leave every year to migrate. And the same thing goes on in India in different ways. So, but thank you for doing that. I think two things I would say. First of all, in terms of response to your question, there is a growing awareness and a need to deal with air pollution and thank you to Ajay Mathur for his excellent talk, the intersection between air pollution and climate change. There is a growing interest in that, whether it be the European Green Deal, the work that is going on that Ajay pointed out in India, a similar work in China, to really understand that we need to do both. We can't just do one or the other. I think secondly, that it's very important, and I know sometimes there are voices in a place like India or in many other countries that say, well, we don't have any local information on what the health effects are of air pollution. And in fact, there is global information and a growing amount of information in every country of the world, including in India. We jointly had a workshop with Dr. Randeep Guleria at AIMS just in December on this very point with some of the leading health investigators in India. And it's a very serious set of issues. It affects people with diabetes. It affects birth outcomes. With, our newest report on clean air will suggest that 500,000 young babies die every year because of air pollution. And it's also important, and I wanted to touch on the COVID issue that you mentioned, because we're very early in understanding exactly how COVID affects people. The data is being collected. We're all struggling with how to control it and how to prevent it. But we do know two things. First of all, when a similar disease, SARS, hit in the 2000s, there was evidence that those who were battling SARS in higher air pollution environments were more likely to have a serious case and to die. COVID is a respiratory disease, and we don't have that hard evidence yet, but it'd be very surprising if we didn't see something similar. And secondly, the comorbidities, the other things that Dr. Joshi rightly pointed out, many of those, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, other things that set people up to be affected by COVID, can also be affected and made worse by air pollution. So in our view, air pollution needs to be a part of the solution, not just to the broader public health, but to the COVID solution. I want to just make one more comment. And this is based on the wonderful pictures we all saw of the India gate during the shutdown, and the graph that Ajay presented of that. What a wonderful thing for that to be true. One of the things we do know from years and years of research is that while short-term effects of air pollution are significant, and there were undoubtedly benefits of that clean air for that short term, the real effects of air pollution are from long-term exposure, the development of disease, the development of underlying problems. And so the kinds of long-term solutions that Ajay was talking about, and this is not just true in India, it's true everywhere, are the most critical ones. Figuring out how to change over, as Shloka said, the entire way in which energy is generated. Figuring out how, and the leapfrog to Bharat Stage 6 was a step, but moving to get transport to be cleaner is going to be critical over the long term. And I would come back to something that Ajay said, household air pollution is a very significant contributor to outdoor as well as indoor air. There is some good news because we've seen reductions over the last decade in India as well as in other countries, but it's still a very significant health problem. And as Ajay pointed out, although it is, the LPG poses some challenges for climate, the black carbon that's coming from household air pollution is a significant concern for climate change as well. So I just will stop by saying there's progress being made. It's great to see. I've been coming to and working in India on these issues for the last 2 decades. And it's great to see the progress that's happening there as in other countries around the world. But we're looking forward to working with you and others it won't take the next 50 years of WWF. It'll be the next, much less than that to get clean air in India.
Thank you very much, Dr. Greenbaum. That was very useful to get an overall perspective of it, global perspective. As usual, I have a whole load of questions for all the panelists myself, but I will have to sort of give up on the temptation because the audience questions are coming in. And I'm going to start with one question which I think should be directed towards Ajay and also possibly Dr. Joshi. Let me read this out, then you decide who wants to answer it or both. It says Delhi is one of the most polluted cities. How effective has the odd and even program been?
I think let Dr. Mathur say something, then I have my own experience and I would say that later.
Okay, Ajay.
Well, let me first say that the odd even program is to come into effect in Delhi only when emergency situations are there, which means the emission levels are in excess of 400 micrograms per kilo. Does it make a difference? First of all, it matters what you include in the bucket. As I mentioned earlier, only 8% of the pollution in winter months is from cars. So if you restrict it to cars, the theoretical maximum you can have is 4%, or in odd and even. What we get is much less. And we get much less because of a variety of reasons. It's because of leakage. People drive and are not caught. It occurs because of the permissions that are given for particular classes of people to use cars. For example, single women can. But the net impact of the odd even is probably not worth it.
Dr. Joshi?
In fact,
yes, I would,
in one of the cases, it was negative.
I was personally monitoring everyday data on the impact of this odd even, and the response was very erratic. Some day it was a little bit down, but most of the days it stayed where it was. So it did cause a lot of inconvenience to the people and commuters. So overall, I was not very enthusiastic about it right since the beginning, and I don't favor it. As Dr. Mathur said, that besides the car, if you don't control them, you can't actually meet your desired goal.
True. So that is actually my takeaway from those two answers, that at best you will be able to control it by 4%. That is the maximum you can hope for. Dr. Joshi, the next question also is, I suspect, for the two of you, if you would like to go first. It says crop stubble burning causes a severe air pollution. How can this be controlled and prevented?
I think the Ministry of, under the NCAP program, they have allocated a huge amount of funds for farmers and they have incentivized the farmers to go off this habit of stubble burning. But somehow, I don't want to blame anyone, but when I was advisor to Dr. Harshvardhan and the Ministry of Environment and Forest, our feeling was that the state response was rather timid and lukewarm towards the whole project. So I think the states have to show the responsibility, and for reasons I think best known to them, they were not as enthusiastic about the whole stubble burning stoppage as the center wanted them to do it. That's what I would say.
Ajay?
So, the challenge has been, how do we use this stubble instead of burning it? I think it's also important to understand why this stubble is here now and wasn't there earlier. There are two reasons. The first is that I would say, an environmentally proactive manner, the government of Punjab said that paddy would be planted only when monsoons occur, and therefore they would not have to depend on extracting groundwater. This was good. But what it did was that it has pushed paddy sowing late in the year, and therefore paddy harvesting is also late in the year, and therefore the time between the harvesting of paddy and the subsequent planting of wheat is a very small time frame. That's one point. And because it's a very small time frame, the old method of cutting it by hand would no longer work, and machine cutting, which meant that you took the the ears of paddy was there, and the rest of it just stood there. Now think of the second problem. The second problem was that over a period of time, the labor that was used to harvest the paddy and the wheat became very expensive. All of it comes from Bihar to Punjab. As it became expensive, mechanization moved in. Now, the person has cut the ears of paddy. The rest of it is standing there. What do I do? Do I hire people now to cut it? No, I don't. I burn it. So this is the economic rationale, the legal and the economic rationale behind why burning occurs. So I think one of the key issues is that this is an economic problem amongst other things. And we have looked at two ways of addressing it. One is to till it into the soil, the standing crop, so that it enhances the quality of soil. Now, anecdotally, it is said that it enhances the quality of the soil and that people who did it had a 4% better yield and so on. But we need to see those papers in print. Clearly, tillage, in situ tillage has benefits, but again, the large amount of monies that can be made available for harvesters, the so-called happy seeders and so on, has had a limited impact. We need to look at one more issue, which is how do I collect this waste by paying for it? And if I'm paying for it, then it will be worth something. Some things have been done. For example, NTPC has created pellets out of this and burnt it together with coal in their power station at Jajjar. And they found that something of the order of 15% of pellets based on rice husk could be done effectively. And therefore, the government of India said, okay, mix it to half of that, 7%. But the governments of Punjab and Haryana have not gone that way. And this has meant that this market for the collected paddy converted into briquettes has not yet come into place. This is something that we need to address. Similarly, we need to see other uses which would result in an economic value being assigned to this waste. I think that is the direction in which you would start seeing a lot of action this year. This is not to say that there will not be an impact this year. There probably will be, but I think you will start seeing a reducing impact.
Thank you. Yeah,
Jyoti,
you're right. The economic
just
value.
to add one more point on everything that Dr. Mathur said, which I completely second. The Punjab Chief Minister has also said that paddy has no future in the state. So
Yeah.
there is a need. Yeah, there is a need to move towards more sustainable crops. For instance, maize, cotton, etc. That's also a longer-term solution.
Yeah, absolutely. Because of the water usage of paddy, completely agree that it is done. Shloka, don't go away. Then this next question is something that is general, but perhaps you are in a good position to answer this. It basically says, what should governments be doing right now in the short term to alleviate the health crisis that's being worsened by pollution? Right now, what should the governments be doing?
A lot. Where to begin? I think there's a number of pieces that the government sort of can move on and should be moving on when it comes to air pollution. So one is, there needs to be definitely sort of, raising sort of, or rather filling in the current evidence gap. So there is a huge gap when it comes to source apportionment still. There are still gaps on, what is the impact of air pollution on health? How is that impact felt by different groups of people? So we do need to kind of push the envelope when it comes to greater data and research, and government ought to be I think really investing in some of those sort of data and research gaps. The second is just expanding the monitoring network, and that should probably be the first. There's just not enough monitoring networks in the country, so we do need to sort of push that out across the country. Additional data will help develop more specific and nuanced solutions, for a whole host of regions and geographies across the country. The third is on the policy front, we do need to use the data and evidence that we're generating to really identify the right solutions for these different sources, which will then allow policymakers to take the right decisions. They can custom make policies and action plans to then sort of clean the air. Right now a lot of this work is being done by a whole host of wonderful institutions like TERI and many other think tanks. But this is an area where, again, the government, as policymakers, as decision makers, really need to start moving on advocating and sort of bringing out the right policy to deal with, or set of policies to deal with air quality in India. The final one that I'll say is, strengthening state capacity for implementation is something where the government, again, needs to give a lot of emphasis toward. Once we establish solutions, how does the government move forward on actual implementation? And there is a big gap there for government as well. They do need to build their skills and their capacity in implementation and enforcement. And that's, again, a big area where civil society could work together with government to do this and to help them kind of build in those capacity gaps. So I'll pause here, but those are just the sort of
thanks. That's very well summed up. Yes, it's not an easy thing to sum up. There are so many things to be done. I agree. But there is another question which I'll ask Dr. Greenbaum to answer, because it asks about one specific aspect of this on which he may have experience from other countries. The question reads, in the time of the pandemic, maybe not enough people are realizing the importance of urban green spaces. How and what are the measures that the government should take to give a fillip to urban green spaces? Dr. Greenbaum.
That's a very, very good question. I just wanted to add one thing to Shloka's very good summary of actions that could be taken. The NCAP, the National Clean Air Program, is an excellent step. But one of the things that we've learned everywhere in the world where we deal with this, and Ajay and his folks at TERI know this very well, in air pollution knows no boundaries. So individual actions by cities or by states will not solve the problem. It's only there has to be a very strong component from the center in order for the upwind states to take action that can affect the downwind states, and just leaving it to the states will not be a solution. So I just make that larger comment, and that's I actually co-chaired an academy, the National Academy of Sciences Committee reviewing air quality management in the United States, and we've been at this. This is not something you can do in a year or two. We've been at this for 50 years now, and you have to keep working on it, and the center is really important. So to answer the
question on urban green spaces.
Right. We actually have studies underway now around the world looking at the benefits of urban green space in mitigating the effects of transport of emissions and various other things. And there's a growing body of evidence that suggests that, that there's a public health benefit. If someone has access to urban green space, their health will be better. And so finding ways to incentivize this, to make sure that land use, it's not just a matter of making sure that the green spaces are conserved, but also that all of the other activities around them don't infringe on the quality of those green spaces. So there's a lot of planning and zoning activity. I know the smart cities effort within India is trying to do some of that, but I think there needs to be a lot more. I can't say that the US is a model for this. We have not always done it as well as others, nor some parts of Europe, but there are parts of Europe that have been a real model for this and are really prioritizing opening up and preserving green space. And that even goes to how roads are designed, how paths are designed, and maintaining the quality of the experience people have in and around every piece of urban infrastructure.
Thank you. There was a line in Ajay's presentation which is skipped due to lack of time, and now he cannot skip it because there's a question on it. He skipped the line on green buildings, and now there's a question on how do we prevent pollution due to construction.
I am so glad that this has been brought up. Green buildings are amazingly important, and they're important for a variety of reasons. And in fact, I think the COVID pandemic tells us that we need to move towards buildings, regular buildings instead of slums to reduce transmission. Also, as several people have pointed out, that the way affordable housing is built is that they're very uncomfortable, and therefore they need a lot of cooling. The number of hours of discomfort are very large. Consequently, our first issue is to popularize the affordable building designs which minimize hours of thermal discomfort and make them in a manner so that as people's incomes increases, they can add air coolers or they can add air conditioners as time goes by, and those buildings continue to be energy efficient. The challenge to energy efficiency has always been the fact that buildings are made by developers. They are sold to building owners who may or may not be the people who live there, but they may decide to rent them on to third parties. So the costs are borne by the developer, the benefits are taken on by the tenant. This is a problem because buildings look alike, and therefore the developer finds it very difficult to get a higher price for an energy efficient building. This is where certification comes in, because that allows a third party to say this is an efficient building. I think what we need to do is for municipalities to realize the benefits that come to them. It is important to do so because municipalities will say, okay, I make an efficient building, I go through the certification process, what benefit do I get? The benefit that they get is the green buildings get higher property taxes. And therefore, as far as the buildings are concerned, green buildings are an opportunity for the municipality to attract both higher income and higher usage kinds of actions. This will encourage building laws to focus on green buildings, both for affordable housing and others.
Thanks, Ajay. Thanks. There is another very interesting question and a very specific question, which I will request Dr. Joshi and Dr. Greenbaum to answer because it's really in their area. It says, in a very congested space like urban slums, how do we improve air quality so that we don't have transmission of viruses like CoV-2, SARS-CoV-2? Dr. Joshi, would you like to answer that first?
Well, I think it's really a big challenge, and you can't find an overnight solution for that. And that is what has been reflected in the statistics from the Dharavi slums in Mumbai. But certainly, I think I am great votary for education. If you educate the people, it can, offset the adverse impact to some extent. But of course, in the long run, you need a proper housing. And Dr. Mathur said that you need to build houses, affordable, clean, green houses with a lot of green spaces. So it's a long-term solution, and it's very difficult to solve the problem overnight. I don't know, Dr. Greenbaum can have some other thoughts on that.
Yes, Dr. Greenbaum, can you give us some, examples, some models like Freiburg in Germany, maybe some others?
Well, I think that question poses one of the significant challenges we have about an existing set of issues, the quality of the housing, and this is not unique to Mumbai or Kolkata, but around the world, where the ventilation is poor, where the population is living in very close quarters, and we're seeing that in the lowest income sections of the United States, where we're having much higher impacts of COVID than. I think there are two things there. One, I would agree with Dr. Joshi. Education, it is interesting. We have seen in some of this in cities that the willingness of people to say, I'm going to put on a mask and I'm going to be careful about this is greater than it has been in some of the more rural areas. So people with education will see that's a short-term, that's just a short-term solution. I think a second piece is that we, the redoubled efforts to try and reduce the emissions and the pollution coming from multiple sources. Sometimes there can be decisions made to, and as the courts did in Delhi, to not have certain types of older diesel vehicles in a condensed urban area. That's not true throughout India. It's not true in many other places. But they contribute to the air pollution in a much higher and disproportionate way. So there are some short-term actions one can take. That's different from the even-odd question, which I saw some smiles about earlier, because those do cause very immediate exposure. And frankly, there are cleaner technologies available now that are not so bad. So there are some things you can do, but there's this underlying need right now to get people to be aware of what they need to do to protect themselves. And the only good news I would say there is we've seen some evidence, for example, in the coldest, in the parts of the world that have just completed their winter, the southern hemisphere, that actually the flu has not been as bad because people have been taking those actions. They've been wearing masks, they've been washing their hands. And I think if we put our minds to it, that could make a huge difference in the slums of cities around the world.
Thank you very much, Dr. Greenbaum. Right, we are, 18 minutes above the time originally allotted to this. That is due to the excellent presentations and to the excellent questions and answers. But unfortunately, there is a time we need to put an end to this webinar. As I said at the beginning, the recording will be available to everybody. The organizers will make the link available to all of you. So what I'm going to do is to request all four panelists to make any concluding remarks that they may wish to make, and then we shall say bye. Ajay, starting with you.
Joydeep, first of all, I want to apologize for being the reason for the overspill of time. My apologies for the long presentation. The only point that I want to make is that the lockdown helped us realize that cleaner skies are possible. There are also tools and methods by which industry and transport can bring their air pollution emissions down to zero. I think we all need to collectively work to achieve that goal.
Thank you. Dr. Joshi?
Well, I would say that this is the worst experience of last 100 years after Spanish flu. And I think we need to educate people about the public health interventions, as we have no treatment and there is nothing in sight of vaccine. So I think that what we have been teaching and telling people that wash your hands, cover your face and mask, have a good diet, and don't go out if you have comorbid conditions. I think those can play a great role in protecting the health of the people and the onslaught of this infection.
Thank you. Shloka, over to you.
Thanks, Joydeep, and thank you to the whole WWF team for inviting me and the excellent panel today. I just want to sort of make the point that climate change and air pollution are essentially two sides of the same coin. There is a large overlap in sources for air pollution as well as climate change, whether it be power plants or industries, residential cooking and heating, stubble and waste burning. So the co-benefits approach really strongly applies to both. And so many initiatives that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, they have benefits that go beyond contributing to climate change mitigation. And the health and environmental impact is the most obvious co-benefit, but there are many, many other areas, including resource efficiency, economic security, sustainability of ecosystems, as well as increased economic benefits. So I think for all our sakes, and for the future of this planet, as well as our economic growth and recovery, air pollution is definitely something that we need to attack as soon as possible.
Thank you. Dr. Greenbaum.
Well, thank you again for this excellent opportunity and for all the good work of WWF over the years. I would just say two things. One, this is a long-term problem that's going to need long-term solutions. But two, there are solutions. India's move to Bharat Stage 6 for vehicles happened much faster than the similar moves in Europe or the United States, which took decades to make happen. The technologies, as Ajay said, exist, the opportunities exist, and in the end, it's really important to understand that the most important thing to a healthy economy is a healthy community and public health that allows people to go to work, to go to school, and to grow as human beings. And the two go hand in hand.
So a healthy economy is completely dependent on a healthy people and a healthy ecosystem. On that very important note, I'm going to turn it over to the organizers, WWF India, to have the last word. Over to you, Vidya.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Joydeep. First of all, a really heartfelt thanks to all the panelists. From our perspective, the whole purpose of a webinar such as this, which brought climate change and air pollution together, was to connect the dots between the two and also bring the connection between the policy and the end user. And and each of you articulated it so beautifully well, while it gave us a guidance to move forward, whether we look at industries, transportation, waste, sustainable agriculture, heat. So the diversity of the advice and the diversity of perspectives that came about is certainly a very good starting point for all of us to come together. And on that note, I would say we would look forward to be able to work with all of you as well as many others in this foray and try and see how we can, minimize both air pollution and climate change and the resultant health impacts, which is taking center stage increasingly. Thank you very much, each one of you. It was an enthralling conversation, and to all the participants as well. Thank you.